Welcome back to the Vanessa G Fitcast. I'm Vanessa Pozos, and here with me is Omar Pozos, my co-host and husband. How you doing, Omar?
I'm doing great, and I want to give the listeners a little bit of backstory because Vanessa always yells at me when we start our podcast episode how I mess with my microphone. So today I sat down. I got
sit on your hands, dang it. No, I'm doing good today. Feeling good. I feel like it's been a good week, and I mean this is just a very boring way of basically saying that like it's been just a normal good week. And you know, I was sharing about this on Instagram over the weekend, but I think we're just like those kinds of people where yes, we do a lot of fun things. We have, we get to travel and like we just get to do a lot of fun things, but yet like my favorite weeks and weekends are when we're just at home and do absolutely nothing. And I'm like, why do we spend money to travel when like I actually just really enjoy being home and doing absolutely nothing?
We were chatting with our team too that like we went and found a new restaurant to go work at, and you were like, yeah, our new favorite hobby is to go find places to work at.
Well, that's like our highlight when we're sharing on a Monday, like, how was your weekend? I'm like, well, we found a new place to go work on Sunday because we just
that was fun.
We work every day because we just enjoy working, and it's what we like to do.
Right.
No shame in that.
Yep.
Well, today on this episode, I wanted to take kind of like a little bit of an FAQ here. So I'm always getting a lot of questions about labs. And just kind of related to, labs and especially functional labs, since this is something I talk about quite a bit, especially on social media. And so I took 6 of the most common questions I get asked repeatedly, dropped them here, and Omar's going to ask me these questions, and we're just going to kind of rapid fire through them, give you guys some insight in case this is something that you have wondered, or you might find that this information is good for you at a certain point.
Yeah, I like this because you're right. We do get a lot of these questions, and so I want to give you a couple minutes to be able to break this down for us. But all right, so question number 1 says, Vanessa, I can only invest in one right now, Dutch test or GI map. Which one should I invest in?
Yeah, so the 2 most common labs I probably talk about because they're my 2 favorite functional labs, that's the Dutch test and the GI map. So, quick rundown if you're not familiar with these. Dutch test stands for dried urine test for comprehensive hormone analysis. So this is my favorite test for really diving into hormones. GI map is actually kind of exactly what it sounds like. It is essentially mapping out your GI tract. It is a stool test that shows different types of bacteria, pathogens, all these different things going on in your GI tract, right? So really we're kind of separating out as like Dutch test being my favorite hormone test, GI map being my favorite kind of gut health test. Now, obviously when it comes to functional labs, these often, they may or may not be covered by your insurance. It depends. We have many clients who can submit the receipts for insurance and, get reimbursement. But overall, oftentimes, because these are more cutting edge, you're often paying out of pocket. So a lot of women will say, well, I really want to do both eventually, or I would love to do both, but right now, I need to just do one because, investing in myself, I'm going to just stick with one right now. Oftentimes we'll recommend just doing one anyway because most people don't want to, spend a lot of money on labs. I don't want to either. I get that. So when it comes down to which one should we be doing, there's really just more of like an it depends answer here, very much dependent on the person. And I think it also depends who you ask a little bit. Like if I even think about some of the coaches on our team, like I think some of them favor one a little bit more over the others for their own reasons, all being very, very good reasons. And so the reality is they are both really, really, really great lab tests, and they both can be really, really great even just on their own for either situation. So let me explain. A Dutch test, while this is primarily for looking at our hormones, it's looking at our sex hormones, how they're being detoxed through the body. It's looking at cortisol and cortisol patterning and different adrenal hormones.
AKA your stress hormone?
Yep, exactly. It's looking at, organic acids and neurotransmitters and a lot of different aspects of things. What's interesting is the Dutch test actually has what is called indican. So it's a indican marker on the test. So this is actually essentially like a gut health marker that can be checked through urine. And because the Dutch is a urine test, what's cool is you actually get this one marker that can give you a little bit of a snapshot view of what is going on in your gut. So it's really, really helpful for, clients who maybe were like, all right, we think hormones is going to be the main thing we're going to really want to dive into here. And maybe we're suspecting whether it's sex hormones, cortisol, like that's probably where, some of the biggest issues lie. So we might say, hey, for you, let's go the route of doing a Dutch test. And with that, even if we suspect, well, maybe there could be a little bit going on with the gut, because oftentimes there's something going on in the gut if we are experiencing hormone imbalances because they are so linked anyway, that indican marker can give us good insight into whether or not the gut is something we really need to dive into through that indican marker. So super helpful, super useful, right? GI map, similar. So GI map, obviously, this is more of a gut test. We're looking at different types of bacteria and pathogens, viruses, different things going on there. Well, the cool thing about the GI map is it also can give you a glimpse into hormone health because it also actually tests for a enzyme called beta-glucuronidase.
Say that 3 times.
Yeah.
Beta-glucuronidase.
And the cool thing about this enzyme, though, is this enzyme actually is partly kind of responsible for estrogen getting reactivated. So if we're not detoxifying our estrogen very well, which if you think of like kind of everything going down a stream, different hormones kind of flow into each other as they're like converted in the body. Estrogen's kind of the bottom of that stream. It's what's going to get like pushed out of the body at the very end. Well, if your beta-glucuronidase is high, that's essentially showing that you're not detoxifying estrogen very well. So while, of course, a Dutch is a great way to look at specifically how we are detoxifying our hormones and kind of where the levels are at, that beta-glucuronidase can give you insight into, is there something more going on with our hormones? And then, of course, oftentimes clients, we can maybe get them to do blood work through their doctor, through insurance. So that might be something we can additionally do to kind of get a little bit of a glimpse at hormones. So in that instance, if someone's dealing with a lot of gut symptoms, I might say, hey, let's do the GI map. That's still going to give us a glimpse into what's going on with hormones. And then, if we are really tight on budget, but we really need to see where hormones are at, maybe we can go the insurance route on at least getting a basic, snapshot view of hormones via blood work.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it sounds like kind of what you're saying is it depends on your symptoms, depends where you have the strongest symptoms, and then based off of that, we kind of navigate things and pick one or the other, or ultimately, if we could do both, then that'd be fantastic kind of thing.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. I like, especially if a client's coming in, if we want to start with labs, I often like to let them kind of have insight into, are they more interested in one lab over the other? Because ultimately, both are going to be extremely beneficial.
Yeah. And to your point, you're right. When there are, years of hormonal imbalances or gut issues, it's like a bit of a domino effect where one thing starts to impact another. So eventually we're probably going to need multiple ones to get an understanding of a full comprehensive picture of your body, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Gotcha. Cool. All right. Question number 2. It says, Vanessa, when do I take a Dutch test if I don't have a regular cycle?
Yeah, very common question. So when it comes to a Dutch test, because we are checking hormones, we do want to check at a specific time of the cycle. This is something that I could even go a different question here of oftentimes people also ask, not even a question.
Cycle?
No, they'll not necessarily ask it as a question, but they'll say, I want to check my hormones, but my doctor's telling me it doesn't matter because hormones fluctuate. And that is, I always find that's the most ridiculous answer. And that is completely just doctors basically just not wanting to check your hormones, being like, you're fine. You're young. Maybe you're not showing signs that we feel like we have to dive into that. So sometimes they'll just kind of give you a little bit of BS because that's ridiculous. The way that you check your hormones is you check at a specific time of the cycle, and you do that every time so you can comparatively see where you are at that point in the cycle.
That makes sense. That
point is typically we want to capture what is about 5 to 7 days after ovulation. So post-ovulation, you have this spike in estrogen and progesterone that we want to kind of see what that's looking like. That's why we can kind of see, are these hormones at the levels that we want them to be at for that point in the cycle. It's more useful than looking at if we did it at a point in the cycle where hormones are low. You can't really tell, are they low because they're just too low all month long, or are they low because they're supposed to be low at that point in the cycle? Capturing that peak at that 5 to 7 days post-ovulation can help us see if hormones are actually too low or not. Now, with that, next question then becomes, well, okay, if I have, a irregular cycle, like you mentioned, I don't know when I'm ovulating, I don't know when I'm going to get my period because it's inconsistent every month. There's a lot of questions that come up with that. So giving the kind of blanket answer of 5 to 7 days post-ovulation, not super helpful for a lot of people. So what's most helpful, in my opinion, is if you actually understand the why, and then you can kind of figure out what's going to be best for you here. So again, why 5 to 7 days post-ovulation? We want to capture that little bit of a spike there. Well, on what is considered a normal cycle, which is 28 days, 5 to 7 days post-ovulation will typically be between days 19 through 21. So if you have a cycle that is longer than 28 days, all we need to do is a little bit of basic math here. If you are, a 30-day cycle, that's 2 days longer than a normal 28-day cycle. We're simply adding 2 days onto that 19 to 21 window, right?
Yeah.
Same thing of like if it's shorter, let's say you have a 25-day cycle, then we're just going to subtract off 3 from that 19 through 21-day window.
Where does the 3 come from again?
Because a 28-day cycle, if it was shortened to 25.
3 days. Got it. Okay,
yeah.
gotcha.
We got to do a little bit basic math here.
Well, I was laughing because you looked at me and I was like, you're going to make me do this. Yeah. And I was like, I don't know where you're going with this. So anyways.
You were like getting ready to pull out your calculator.
Yes, I'm like 3 plus 3. Got it. Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. So it's basic math. However many days beyond 28 days your cycle generally is, add that onto the 19 through 21 window. How many days less than 28 your cycle generally is, subtract that. Well, again, coming back to cycle irregularities, that can mean a lot of things. For some people, they're like, well, my cycle is irregular because my cycle is always, 35 days long. Mm-hmm. For some people, when they say my cycle is irregular, they might mean that sometimes my cycle is 40 days, sometimes it's 25 days, and I never know what to expect. That's when it's tricky. We know, obviously, at that point that there's definitely some hormonal imbalances going on, leading to these, huge swings and irregularities, right? So the best way to go about things, I'll give you kind of 2 methods here, but the best way I would say is actually to figure out when you're ovulating. So how do we figure out when you're ovulating? 2 methods. You can use LH testing strips. These are pretty cheap. You could probably buy them from Amazon. Basically, like peeing on a stick, check, it'll tell you. That's where you can kind of figure out when your ovulation actually is. And then once you ovulate, 5 to 7 days or so past that. And the other option is through basal body temperature. So this is where, a lot of women who are not on birth control will use BBT to keep track of their cycle. That might look like using natural cycles with the thermometer. That might look like using an Oura ring.
You used to do that, right? Where you would take your temp every single morning?
Yeah, before I had an Oura ring, that's what I did. Didn't really like doing that because it requires you to take your temperature every morning, and that's just too much work for me. That's why I got an Oura ring, and I highly recommend. So that would be like the best way is
Shout
figure
out
out
Oura ring if they want to sponsor us, by the way.
That's the best way. Figure out when you're ovulating to kind of capture when that window is, and then besides that, like if you are at this point where you're just like, I don't think I even am ovulating and my cycle's all over the place, because that can also happen if you're having these big swings in the length of your menstrual cycle. It's also very well possible that you don't ovulate right now. What we still want to do as best as possible to capture that window. So what I would do then is look at the last 6 months of cycles you've had and average out the length and use that for this upcoming cycle. It might not be perfect, but that's where ultimately we're going to kind of like take all of that information, at least in our program, we'll kind of factor all of that in when assessing your results. And on that point too, if you are so irregular that you don't even have a cycle, so like amenorrhea, you don't have a period, at that point, you just can do it anytime because you're not having those spikes and peaks anyway. So just try to get it when you can get it done.
Gotcha. And then on top of that too, and this will lead to the next question, but it says, Vanessa, what labs can I do while I'm on birth control?
Yeah, great question. So when it comes to being on birth control, the question I would ask back is, what is your goal with this? So what is your goal of getting labs done? Because you can do any labs, but the usefulness of doing labs while on birth control, and when I say, doing labs, I'm specifically more so talking about checking our sex hormones. Mm-hmm. The usefulness of that while on birth control is debatable. Depends on like what you're trying to get out of it. So if you are planning on coming off of birth control, it might be helpful to check your hormones. And I would more so say, just get some blood work done. That way you can kind of see a baseline level of what does it look like now, so that then as you go through that journey of regulating your hormones post-birth control, you can see where they're at. Now, a lot of people, and myself included at times because it's very context dependent, will say it's not even helpful, not necessary, because the reality is when you check your hormones on birth control, and of course the type of birth control does depend here, different types are kind of affecting different things, but as a whole, for the most part, your hormones are going to be bottomed out when you're on birth control. So checking your hormones, that's where, a lot of doctors and practitioners and, often myself in many cases will say, just doesn't really make sense, not really useful, because we kind of know what to expect. Your hormones are just going to be bottomed out. Mm-hmm. Now, if you are not wanting to come off of birth control in that instance, then okay, if there are things that we want to be looking at, this is where a Dutch test can still be helpful. Of course, a Dutch test when you're not on birth control is going to be more insightful, more valuable, because we can see again where hormones are at. We can really work on regulating hormones. If we're on birth control, we can't really get hormones in balance, right? Your birth control is going to be kind of affecting that already with having these synthetic hormones. But the cool thing is that the Dutch test is not just about checking levels of our sex hormones. We can actually see how our hormones are being detoxified through the body, like how they're being metabolized, how they're breaking down, how they're flowing through. That can be helpful when we're on birth control. In addition to that, of course, the Dutch test is not just about our sex hormones. It also looks at cortisol and cortisol patterning. It looks at neurotransmitters, organic acids, like can give us a lot of insight into other markers as well that can be extremely helpful while still on birth control and while, maybe somebody is wanting to stay on birth control long term. We just have to make sure at the end of the day that if your plan is to stay on birth control, we have realistic expectations around how much we can actually balance out hormones because, there's only so much we can do, of course.
Yeah.
Now, with a GI map, though, that's where, we talked about the actual hormones and checking that while on birth control. GI map, you can absolutely do while on birth control. I actually think it can be very, very valuable to do while on birth control because of the fact that we know that birth control does affect the gut microbiome. So if you have been on birth control for, multiple years, it is very likely that there is some gut dysfunction going on there. And that's where doing a GI map can be helpful to see specifically what's going on. We just, again, have to have realistic expectations that there's only so much we can do to fix the issue if we are not removing the variable that might be contributing to that issue, which could be birth control.
Yeah, but it sounds like, from what you shared, it's still very insightful to see the patterning, is that a word, patterning? Did I say
patterning?
That patterning, the ups and downs of kind of how your body's processing, metabolizing all this. Very
Absolutely.
Cool. All right, so next one, Vanessa. If I'm trying to get pregnant, is a Dutch test a good idea for me?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're trying to get pregnant, a Dutch test is a great option for you to be looking at your hormones, seeing how hormones are being detoxified, seeing what levels are at, all of the things that a Dutch test provides for us. Now, what we need to be kind of aware of is if we are actively trying to conceive, I would recommend that if you're going to do a Dutch test, that month you might want to hold off on trying specifically during ovulation, because if you then do the Dutch test 5 to 7 days post ovulation and you did actually get pregnant that cycle, essentially the Dutch test, the results are not going to be usable and valid because it's not meant for checking it while pregnant. So then you would end up kind of wasting this test. So for that reason, just something to be aware of. If you are actively trying, you might want to hold off that month. So obviously, if you're someone who has been trying for a while, you've been struggling to conceive, this might be a good option for you to say, okay, let's just pull back this month and let's focus on doing that internal repair, starting with actually doing a Dutch test.
Yeah.
With that being said, if we are having trouble conceiving, there's very, very likely some things going on. The Dutch test can be incredibly helpful for that. Now, even for those who may not necessarily have trouble conceiving, so like if you are anticipating that you want to start, trying for a baby, I definitely recommend doing a Dutch test if you've never done one before, because there is so much that a Dutch test will show that will impact the overall quality and, health of your pregnancy. Progesterone, huge for making sure we have a healthy pregnancy. That can ultimately, if our progesterone's low, that can definitely increase your likelihood for a miscarriage. Cortisol, even on a Dutch test, can be really helpful because cortisol imbalances can lead to, how you recover postpartum. Like postpartum depression can often be attributed to some cortisol imbalances or just be linked to cortisol imbalances as well. Estrogen detoxification on the Dutch test, that can be huge as well. There's a lot of different complications that have been traced as well to estrogen and estrogen detoxification, all these different aspects. So I am a huge fan that it is definitely something to look into and consider if you've never done one before and you are planning on trying to conceive.
Yeah, awesome. All right, next one. It says, Vanessa, I don't know why I asked it like this, but anyways, Vanessa, can I do a Dutch test while postmenopausal and on HRT?
Yeah, absolutely. Dutch tests can be very helpful when you are postmenopausal. Kind of similar to what we talked about for irregular cycles. So if you don't have a cycle, you are not having a period, you are postmenopausal, then you don't have to worry about, capturing that 5 to 7 day post-ovulation window. You can just take it any time of the month. The only thing that you do need to be aware of is when on HRT, there are sometimes certain types of HRT that we need to be specific about how we're taking them, when we're taking them around a Dutch test. That can vary because there just are a lot of different types. So that's where it can be context dependent for sure. But I do think that a Dutch test while on HRT or while planning to start HRT, like really anything around an HRT journey for especially a postmenopausal woman, can be extremely helpful, because even just looking at the way we can see our estrogen detoxification on a Dutch test, if you are adding more hormone into your body, but you're not detoxifying it very well, or maybe you are detoxing it down pathways that are associated with higher risk of estrogen-related cancers, or detoxing down pathways that are more estrogenic, more symptomatic, might have more like breast tenderness and some of these just very uncomfortable symptoms, things like that. If we just add more hormone in with HRT, we're probably going to exacerbate those issues if we're not aware of how we are ultimately detoxing our hormones.
Yeah. Another great example, and I know you've shared this before, is when somebody's having GI issues, right? And they're like, oh, I'm going to take a probiotic or a prebiotic. And then you're just adding more bacteria to the bacteria that's causing these symptoms anyways. And you're just kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? You're just making things worse.
Yeah, just exacerbating issues.
Yeah. Ooh, big word. Cool. All right. Awesome. So last but not least, Vanessa, what labs should I ask my doctor for?
Yeah, I saved this question for last. I think it's a really important question that I get asked often, but I probably don't even get asked as much as the other questions here, because obviously I'm a huge fan of really incredible functional lab testing, like the Dutch test, like the GI map, some different things that we use. But we can't overlook the fact that getting regular blood work, oftentimes you can get it from your doctor through insurance. Like, there's so much value in that. And I think it's something that every woman should, be doing and taking advantage of.
And if you're paying for it, you might as well get your money's worth.
Exactly. If that's an option for you, why not take advantage of that? Of course, what a doctor is, willing to pull depends on the doctor. I have some clients who have doctors who are incredible, and they'll just pull anything that we, tell the client, hey, ask your doctor if you can get this. And they're like, done, got it for you. I have other clients who they might ask their doctor if they can get a certain test done, and the doctor will push back. They'll, kind of say like, you don't need that, or they'll question them and different things. And so it definitely depends on the situation. And so ultimately, if you need to at least be kind of armored with like, what do you think that you need? What do you want? You need, education, and this is what's going to empower you to be able to do that. So the basics that I would ultimately recommend, and this is something you can get done really on a kind of like an annual visit. These are some things that you can ask for. Not all of these you might not need to get done. You might not need, need to get done yearly, but I think everything on my list here, you would benefit from getting done yearly. So first one, very basic, comprehensive metabolic panel. This is called a CMP. Now, this is going to look at your kidney, liver function, electrolytes, blood sugar. It's going to have fasting glucose, calcium, sodium, potassium, ALT, AST, some liver markers there. Lots of really valuable things to give us an overall kind of basic look at some of these different metabolic processes in our body, right? We also would want to look at a complete blood count. That's a CBC. That's looking at, red and white blood cells, hemoglobin, platelets. It's looking at infections, potential autoimmune concerns. Like, there's a lot we can kind of tell here. If a client's like, especially symptomatic and showing potentially some autoimmune things going on, this can be a very basic first look at what's going on there. A lipid panel, so that's looking at cholesterol.
I just had that done, by the way.
Yeah, go you. Woohoo. But a lipid panel looks at cholesterol, LDL, HDL, triglycerides, a lot of good stuff there. A thyroid panel. This is something that I would like to specify that when I say a thyroid panel, I mean like a complete thyroid panel. So I don't mean just TSH. Most doctors, and this is a broad statement because I do think a lot of doctors have come around to this more recently, I've found, but especially in the past, a lot of doctors, when they say, I'm going to check your thyroid, or if you say, can I get a thyroid panel, many times they will just pull TSH.
And that's thyroid stimulating hormone? Is
exactly.
that right? Okay, cool.
Yep. So TSH, really helpful. Definitely want to check it. but TSH standalone doesn't really give you a whole lot of insight into what's actually happening with the thyroid. So when I say a thyroid panel, I mean a full thyroid panel. So of course TSH to start, but I also want to see free T3, free T4, reverse T3. Ideally, it'd be great if we can see thyroid antibodies as well. So TPO and TGA, like these are all really great things. In general, when it comes to blood work, like the more the merrier, in my opinion, the more we can check, but it's just ultimately what you can get from your doctor, from your insurance, things like that. Kind of the next category I would love for someone to be able to dive into is some additional inflammation markers. So, we talked about some of the markers that we're going to be getting in that comprehensive metabolic panel, and depending on who is pulling your labs, different things might be in different combinations, but if we can get some additional, like C-reactive proteins and different things here, that can be really beneficial. Obviously, pulling like some vitamin and mineral status would be helpful. Again, some of these will be wrapped up in that CMP, but if we can look at vitamin D, B12, folate, magnesium, and then, again, kind of are looking at our glucose. So typically fasting glucose is going to be kind of part of that CMP, but if we can also get fasting insulin, that's really great. And if they don't already pull it, a hemoglobin A1C, which is more of like that average over 3 months of what your blood sugars have looked like. So all of that together, it's like if you're just getting one of those variables there, it might not be helpful, but when you can get all this data, you're just essentially taking like more pieces of the puzzle. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like putting together a puzzle. We can kind of run with that analogy there. If I just give you one piece of the puzzle, you don't really know what the picture on the puzzle is going to look like until I give you more and more pieces, you can put it all together. So that's where the more you can get, the better. If you can kind of ask your doctor for all those things, all power to you. If you can get all those things, that is awesome, because a lot of doctors will not pull that much, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I just want to say this too, you guys. Obviously, I'm not a doctor. I don't know what any of these things are. How do I, read them? How do I implement the right protocols? So I think, and Vanessa, you can add on to this too, but this is where having somebody that is an expert in all of these things can very much help you solve that puzzle piece of what your body is or isn't doing. I think that's where a lot of this becomes so much more beneficial, because it's not about the data. It's not about the testing. It's what you do with it after the fact.
Oh,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Labs without being able to actually interpret and know what to do with results, how to fix and correct issues, labs are virtually meaningless and just valueless at that point. And that's where a lot of people will get frustrated, because labs are almost becoming more and more available now to consumers. There's a lot of companies that will offer labs direct to consumer, and then people get these labs and they're like, I don't know what to do with this, and ends up being kind of a waste of their money. So that's where I do, of course, it does not by any means have to be our team, but I do highly recommend that you work with a professional to get the right labs for your situation, but also to be able to interpret and use that data effectively.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, thank you guys so much for listening. I hope this episode was helpful for you. If it was, do me a favor, send it to a friend, post it on your Instagram story, spread the word. That is how you can help us reach more people with this free education.
And if you don't mind, if you enjoyed the episode, please leave us a 5-star rating, whether you're listening to on Apple or Spotify or any other streaming service that you are, because again, like Vanessa said, that is the best way for us to help keep spreading the good word. Most importantly, to reach out to others that haven't yet found us. So thank you so much. Thank you guys so much for doing that.
Yeah. Thank you for listening. We'll be back next week.
Bye, everybody.